The story of Habakkuk begins differently from other prophetic books. Instead of announcing judgments to the people or bringing specific messages from God, the prophet initiates a direct and profound dialogue with the Creator himself, a dialogue that many might consider bold or even dangerous. Habakkuk does not speak to the people of Judah, he speaks to God. What makes this prophet so special is that his words carry an emotional and spiritual weight that resonates in any era, including ours. At that moment in history, the kingdom of Judah faced a scenario of collapse. It was a time marked by violence, corruption, and injustice, both among the leaders and the common people. While many prophets in the Bible brought messages of judgment or hope directly from God, Habakkuk begins with a complaint, almost a lament. He is troubled, perplexed, and frustrated. He sees evil triumphing before his eyes, and to him the situation was unsustainable. Imagine the scene. The streets of Judah are filled with violence. The weakest suffer at the hands of the powerful, and no one seems to do anything about it. The government does not care, the laws are ignored, and those with any power take the opportunity to exploit others. Habakkuk can no longer bear to watch this reality. He looks to the heavens and asks, why isn't God intervening? Why does he remain silent while evil prevails? This marks the beginning of his spiritual journey, a journey filled with difficult questions and surprising answers. Habakkuk does not speak merely as a prophet. He speaks as someone who suffers with the reality around him. His heart is heavy and his faith is being tested. That's why he takes a rare step. He confronts God with his doubts. Instead of keeping it all to himself, Habakkuk chooses to question the Creator directly, seeking to understand what is happening. This reveals something profound about Habakkuk's relationship with God. He has enough freedom to express his anguish, doubts, and frustrations. Habakkuk does not doubt God's existence. He doubts God's silence in the face of so much injustice. The introduction to the book of Habakkuk does not present us with a perfect man or a serene prophet. On the contrary, Habakkuk is a real man with real emotions. He approaches God with sincerity, even though his words are laden with pain and confusion. To better understand the depth of this introduction, we need to remember that, in Jewish tradition, questioning God was not considered a lack of faith. On the contrary, it was seen as an honest expression of seeking answers and a demonstration of intimacy with the Creator. Habakkuk, therefore, teaches us something very valuable in the first moments of his narrative. God allows his servants to question him. This does not mean rebellion or disrespect. It means that our relationship with God can be deep enough to allow for vulnerability. Habakkuk is not criticizing God for the sake of criticism. He is trying to understand what seems incomprehensible. He does not hide his pain or pretend that everything is fine. He brings his concerns to the only one who can truly provide answers. As Habakkuk looks at the society around him, he sees the contrast between God's holiness and the reality of human sin. For him, the situation is unbearable because he knows who God is, a just, holy, and faithful God. It is precisely this knowledge that makes his questions even more intense. If God is just, why doesn't he act? If God is holy, why does he allow evil to prosper? These questions are, in fact, expressions of faith. Only someone who believes in God can question his apparent inaction. Only someone who trusts in God's character can be anguished when it seems he is not acting. This first interaction between Habakkuk and God is not merely a lament. It is the beginning of a sincere quest for understanding. The prophet refuses to accept silence as an answer. He cries out, he questions, and he waits. It is important to note that Habakkuk does not seek human solutions to Judah's problems. He does not attempt to mobilize the people or start a rebellion. Instead, he turns his eyes to God because he knows that only the Creator can provide a true solution. This introduction to the book confronts us with a profound reflection. What do we do when God seems distant? How do we react when our prayers go unanswered? Habakkuk invites us to be honest with God. He shows us that we can take our hardest questions to the Father because He is able to handle our doubts and weaknesses. The first chapter of the book does not give us immediate answers. Habakkuk is only beginning his journey of questioning and seeking. The prophet speaks with sincerity, and God has yet to respond. But one thing is clear: the dialogue has begun. Habakkuk has opened his heart, and now he waits for the divine response. This waiting is full of tension and expectation, but it is also a sign of faith. Habakkuk has not given up on God. He is seeking to understand what he cannot yet see. At the end of this first encounter, God's silence still looms over Habakkuk's words. He remains distressed and confused, but now he stands before the Creator, waiting for an answer. Habakkuk has taken the first step of his journey. He has brought his questions to God. What comes next is the Lord's surprising response, a response that will challenge not only Habakkuk's understanding, but also his faith. The dialogue between the prophet and God is only just beginning, and the Lord's words will bring to light truths that are hard to accept. As Habakkuk waits, the seeds of a transformative revelation begin to be planted. Divine justice operates in ways that human eyes cannot always comprehend. The story is only just beginning. The setting in which Habakkuk finds himself is complex and laden with tensions. Life in Judah at the end of the 7th century BC reflects a nation on the brink of collapse, both spiritually and socially. The prophet stands at a crucial moment in history when the fate of God's people seems to hang by a thread. To understand the depth of the questions Habakkuk asks and the gravity of the answers he seeks, we must delve into the historical circumstances that shaped his lament and the reality of that time. Judah was living through the final days of its autonomy as a kingdom. After the fall of the northern kingdom, Israel, to the Assyrians in 722 BC, the southern kingdom, Judah, survived as a sort of buffer state, maintaining some independence but always under the shadow of the great powers surrounding it. However, with the decline of the Assyrian Empire, a new threat was beginning to rise: the Babylonians, also known as the Chaldeans. This people, renowned for their military strength and brutality, were expanding rapidly, conquering territories and eliminating their rivals. Habakkuk saw the danger drawing ever closer, and his heart anguished as he realized that Judah's future would not be peaceful. But Judah's problem was not only external, the internal situation was equally dire. The leadership of the kingdom was marked by corruption, violence, and injustice. The laws given by God, meant to guide the people in righteousness and justice, had become empty words. The judicial system was broken, and those in power used their authority to oppress the weak. The prophets, priests, and kings, who should have served as spiritual guides, had become corrupt. The righteous were few, and their voices were drowned out by the roar of the wicked who prospered. The prophet Habakkuk witnessed all this happening around him and felt powerless. He saw the poor being exploited, widows and orphans being forgotten, and violence becoming the common language in Judah's streets. Political and military alliances failed, and the people's faith seemed to deteriorate. Fewer and fewer people trusted God, and true worship gave way to empty rituals or pagan practices. Meanwhile, on the international stage, Babylon was emerging as the unstoppable force. Under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians swept away the remnants of the Assyrian Empire and crushed Egypt, becoming the new superpower of the Middle East. Their military campaigns were swift, relentless, and extremely violent. The fame of the Chaldeans spread like a tempestuous wind, bringing fear and submission to every nation in their path. For Judah, this new empire posed a direct threat. As a prophet, Habakkuk was not blind to this reality. He knew that God could use powerful nations to discipline his people, as had happened before. However, the idea that God would allow such a cruel and pagan people to be the instrument of judgment against Judah was something the prophet simply could not comprehend. Here Habakkuk's anguish deepened. On one hand, he saw the wickedness within Judah, where the rich abused the poor and violence became routine. On the other hand, he saw Babylon growing stronger with an unstoppable military force. He looked up to God and wondered, why do you allow all this to happen? The situation seemed hopeless. To Habakkuk, it felt as though there was no longer any hope for Judah. The people were spiritually bankrupt, and a greater threat was at their doorstep. The prophet's anguish was amplified because he knew who God was. He knew the God who had delivered Israel from Egypt, who had guided his people through the wilderness and established them in the promised land. This God was just, holy, and faithful. So how was it possible for him to remain silent in the face of such sin and suffering? How could the God of justice allow evil to prosper both within Judah and beyond? For Habakkuk, these questions were not theoretical. They were deeply practical and personal. He was witnessing the collapse of his nation and felt abandoned. This tension between God's holiness and the reality of human sin is the backdrop for the entire dialogue Habakkuk would have with the Lord. The prophet knew that God was sovereign and that nothing escaped his control. Yet he struggled to reconcile this sovereignty with God's apparent delay in acting. The silence of God seemed deafening. Habakkuk cried out, but to his eyes the prayers were unanswered. The nation was sinking and the enemy was approaching. This historical moment carried a weight that could not be ignored. The prophet was not merely an observer, he was a man deeply involved in the situation of his people. He felt the weight of injustice and the terror of the imminent threat. He carried Judah's pains in his heart and presented them before God, awaiting an answer. His anguish did not stem from a rebellious heart, but from a heart that loved justice and knew the goodness of God. It is in this context of confusion and suffering that the book of Habakkuk begins to unfold. Babylon is rising, Judah is falling, and God's silence hangs over everything. The prophet finds himself in the midst of this chaotic scene, trying to find meaning in the apparent divine abandonment. He seeks answers, but so far, all he finds are more questions. Habakkuk's world is not so different from ours. We live in a time where injustice also seems to prevail, where wars, corruption, and violence are constant. Many, like Habakkuk, look around and ask, where is God in all this? Habakkuk shows us that these questions are not new, and that even in the darkest moments of history, we can bring our anguish before the Lord. The prophet does not give up seeking. He refuses to accept silence as a definitive answer. And while chaos seems to reign, Habakkuk waits. He awaits God's response because deep down, he still believes that the Lord is just and faithful. This faith, even amidst confusion, is what sustains the prophet as he seeks to understand what is happening. Habakkuk does not yet know what God will say. He has no answers, but the simple act of bringing his questions before the Creator already demonstrates an act of faith. He is willing to listen, even if the answers are difficult to accept. And that is exactly what happens. When God finally responds, his words challenge everything Habakkuk thought he knew. The Lord's response will not be the end of the prophet's questions, but it will mark the beginning of a new understanding of who God is and how he works in the world. Habakkuk stands before an overwhelming tension, the spiritual and social collapse of Judah, the growing injustice spreading like a shadow, and the silence of God. Everything the prophet sees around him deeply afflicts him. He observes God's chosen people, the very ones who were delivered from Egypt and meant to reflect divine holiness, completely corrupted. What was once a nation united by the law and the promise is now fragmented by greed, violence, and idolatry. There is no justice, and the innocent suffer at the hands of the powerful. This situation leads him to ask a bold and, for many, uncomfortable question. Why is God allowing this? In the first chapter, starting from verse 2, Habakkuk begins his dialogue with God, expressing his frustration in words charged with emotion and despair. He asks, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen?" Here, the prophet's pain overflows. It is not a simple lament, but the cry of someone weary of witnessing evil triumph and waiting for an answer that never comes. Habakkuk is not questioning God's existence or power, but rather his apparent inaction. To the prophet, divine silence in the face of suffering is difficult to bear. Habakkuk sees sin growing like a plague within Judah. People no longer follow the law. Judges are bought and the poor are crushed by the injustice of the rich. Violence fills the streets, and those who try to do good are persecuted or ignored. Truth, which should be the foundation of any society, has been replaced by lies and oppression. He clearly describes this situation in verse 4. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. For Habakkuk, the world has turned upside down. What should be right has become wrong, and what should be condemned has been accepted. The prophet sees this happening not just among pagan nations, but among God's very own people, making it all the more painful. Habakkuk knows that God is holy and just, yet he cannot understand why he seems to allow such injustice to prosper. He cries out, and heaven seems to remain silent. Habakkuk, like anyone who has faced great suffering, begins to wonder, is God listening? Does God care? In this questioning, it is important to recognize that Habakkuk is not abandoning his faith. On the contrary, he is turning to the only place where he believes he will find an answer: God himself. Habakkuk understands that his doubts will not be resolved by human answers, politics, or military strength. Only the Creator can clarify what is happening. Therefore, the prophet approaches God with complete honesty, unafraid to express his deepest anguish. This attitude of Habakkuk teaches us something powerful. True faith is not one that ignores difficulties or pretends that everything is fine. It is a faith that approaches God with sincerity, even when the pain feels overwhelming. Habakkuk does not hide his doubts or confusion. He speaks openly, trusting that God will hear. He shows us that to have faith does not mean to have all the answers, but to know where to turn when the questions seem too big. At the same time, Habakkuk's questioning reflects a universal reality. How often do we look at the world around us and wonder why God allows bad things to happen? Why do the wicked prosper while the righteous suffer? Why do prayers seem unanswered? These questions span the centuries and find resonance in the hearts of people throughout time. Suffering and injustice are not new problems. They have accompanied humanity since the fall. Habakkuk, as a representative of all who have questioned God's silence, puts these doubts into words. Moreover, Habakkuk understands that the situation in Judah is not just a social or political problem, it is a spiritual crisis. The people have turned away from God, opening the door for sin to dominate the nation. When justice is abandoned and the human heart is corrupted, the result is always the same: chaos, suffering, and destruction. Habakkuk recognizes that the real issue is not just injustice, but the rupture between the people and the God of justice. Yet he still cannot understand why God allows this to continue. Why does God not intervene and restore order? This tension between God's holiness and the reality of sin is at the center of Habakkuk's first questioning. He knows that God is just, yet he cannot see justice in the world around him. He knows that God is faithful, yet he cannot comprehend divine silence. Habakkuk's struggle is the struggle of all who seek to understand the relationship between a holy God and a fallen world. As the prophet cries out and waits for an answer, his attitude challenges us to reflect on our own faith. How do we respond when confronted with injustice? Do we have the courage to bring our questions to God, or do we turn away in silence? Habakkuk invites us to be honest in our walk with God, to acknowledge that we do not have all the answers, but that we can trust the one who does. At this point, Habakkuk remains in the dark. He has asked his questions and poured out his heart before God, but he has not yet received an answer. Heaven's silence continues, and the tension between the prophet's faith and the reality he sees remains. Habakkuk is waiting. He is waiting for God to speak, waiting for the Creator to break the silence and bring light to the darkness. In the meantime, the prophet stands where he began, looking at the chaos in Judah and trying to reconcile his faith with what he sees. He knows an answer must come, but he has no idea what God will say. What he does not yet realize is that the Lord's response will change everything, though it will not be easy to hear. God is about to speak, and his words will be as surprising as they are unsettling. Habakkuk has cried out, and now he must be ready for the divine answer, even if that answer challenges all his expectations. Habakkuk, weary and perplexed by God's silence in the face of Judah's corruption, finally hears the divine response. However, the answer God gives him is not what he expected. In his sovereignty, God announces a plan that completely challenges human logic. Instead of immediate restoration or spiritual revival, the Lord reveals something even harder to accept. He will use the Babylonians, a cruel and godless people, as an instrument of judgment against Judah. In chapter 1, verses 5 to 11, God begins with a statement that surely captures Habakkuk's attention. Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. Habakkuk 1:5. This declaration prepares the prophet for a revelation so astonishing that it would seem unbelievable, even if fully explained. The tone of God's words suggests something both grand and terrifying. The prophet asked for an answer, and God replied, but the response came with a weight and gravity he had not anticipated. The Lord continues, describing the Babylonians in striking detail. In verses 6 and 7, he introduces them as a ruthless and impetuous nation, an unstoppable force that sweeps across the world to seize lands that do not belong to them. They are portrayed as a people filled with pride, lacking moral restraint, acting solely according to their own will. God uses words that reveal the wild and relentless nature of this army. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Habakkuk 1:7. This description must have felt like a blow to Habakkuk. He asked for justice, but divine justice will come through a people even more wicked than Judah. The Babylonians have no fear of God. They act with unchecked violence and possess a power that seems uncontrollable. In verses 8 and 9, God illustrates the speed and brutality of this army, comparing their horses to leopards and hungry wolves. Their cavalry arrives so quickly that they seem like eagles swooping to devour. Their advance is unstoppable, bringing terror and destruction wherever they go. They laugh at kings, scoff at fortresses, and devastate cities with ease. The culmination of this description is in verse 11, where God exposes the heart of the Babylonians. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on, guilty people whose own strength is their God. The Babylonians do not just act violently, they are arrogant and idolatrous. They place their trust in their own military strength, treating power as a god. It is hard for Habakkuk to accept that God would use such a wicked people to correct Judah. How can a holy and just God use such impure instruments to accomplish his purposes? Here, a profound tension begins to form in Habakkuk's heart. He understands that Judah needs correction, but God's solution seems to create an even greater problem. Instead of resolving injustice, it appears that God is bringing an evil even more terrible. God's response, far from bringing comfort, raises new questions. Habakkuk asked for justice, But now he is confronted with a divine justice that does not fit within the limits of his human understanding. The use of the Babylonians as an instrument of judgment is a powerful reminder of God's sovereignty. He is not limited by human expectations or plans. His ways are higher, and his thoughts go beyond human comprehension. God is not merely correcting Judah, he is accomplishing his greater purposes in history. Yet the prophet cannot yet see the whole picture. He sees only the impending devastation and wrestles with the apparent incoherence of God's answer. It is important to note that even in the midst of this difficult revelation, God continues to engage with Habakkuk. He does not ignore the prophet's questions or rebuke him for seeking answers. On the contrary, God involves him in a deep and honest dialogue. The divine response, though harsh, is also a demonstration that God is in control. He sees Judah's sin and will not leave it unpunished, but he is also mindful of the sins of the Babylonians. The judgment on Judah is merely part of something larger that God is orchestrating. At this point, Habakkuk finds himself in an even more uncomfortable position than before. He is no longer just grappling with Judah's internal corruption. Now he must accept that God will use an even worse people as an instrument of discipline. The prophet is forced to confront a difficult truth. God's plans do not always make sense to human eyes. Divine justice operates at a level that transcends human understanding, and this reality deeply challenges Habakkuk's faith. At the heart of this dialogue is a message that resonates even today. Many times we ask God to intervene in difficult situations, but when he answers, the response may not be what we expect. Sometimes, God acts in ways that seem contradictory or even unjust to our eyes. However, the divine response always serves a greater purpose, even when we cannot see it in the moment. The use of the Babylonians to discipline Judah is a clear example of this. God is not ignoring sin. He is dealing with it in a sovereign and just manner, though his methods challenge our understanding. Through this response, Habakkuk's faith is put to the test. He asked for justice, and God revealed his plan. But now the prophet must grapple with the difficult reality that divine justice does not always manifest in the way we expect. Habakkuk still has questions, and his journey is far from over. Faced with God's surprising answer, he is compelled to continue the dialogue, seeking to understand how a holy God can use such an impure people to correct the sins of his own people. This internal conflict leads Habakkuk to pose a second, even deeper question. He does not doubt that God is acting, but now he must understand how God's holiness can reconcile with the use of such a wicked instrument as the Babylonians. God's answer has shed light on the divine plan, but has also raised new dilemmas. Habakkuk is ready to question again, and his words reflect the struggle of a heart still seeking to comprehend the mystery of God's justice. Habakkuk, still shaken by God's surprising response, cannot remain silent. The Lord's first revelation had shown that the Babylonian army, a ruthless and cruel people, would be used as an instrument of discipline against Judah. However, upon hearing this, the prophet wrestles with an even deeper and more disconcerting question. How can a holy and just God allow such a wicked nation to punish a people who, despite their sins, still belong to the Lord? In chapter 1, starting from verse 12, Habakkuk resumes his dialogue with God. He begins by acknowledging the Lord's eternal and sovereign nature, as if trying to reaffirm his faith amid his confusion. Habakkuk declares, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction." Habakkuk 1:12. At this moment, the prophet recalls God's covenant with his people. He knows that the Lord will not completely destroy Judah because his promise of faithfulness endures. God does not abandon his own, yet he also recognizes that judgment is necessary and that the Babylonians have been allowed by God to bring correction. However, the prophet cannot reconcile two seemingly opposing realities. How can a pure and holy God, who does not tolerate evil, use such a corrupt nation as an instrument of justice? In verse 13, Habakkuk candidly expresses this difficulty with striking sincerity. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Habakkuk's human logic collides with divine action. The prophet knows that Judah has sinned, but how can it be right for the Babylonians, a far more wicked people, to prevail over them? Habakkuk's description of the Babylonians in the following verses reinforces his point. He compares this cruel nation to fishermen who cast their nets and drag defenseless fish from the sea. According to the prophet, the Babylonians treat nations as vulnerable prey and glory in their own strength. In verse 15 he says, "The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net, he gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad." Habakkuk observes that the Babylonians act with arrogance and violence, destroying everything in their path. They have no mercy, and their only motivation is greed and an insatiable desire for conquest. Habakkuk's criticism does not stop there. He continues, stating in verse 16 that the Babylonians are idolaters of their own power. Therefore they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet, for by their net they live in luxury and enjoy choice food. The image is clear. The Babylonians attribute their victories and wealth to their own weapons and abilities, as if their military success was solely the result of their strength. They treat their weapons and strategies as gods, completely disregarding the true God. For Habakkuk, this makes everything even harder to understand. How can the Lord, who is holy and just, allow such an arrogant and idolatrous people to carry out his judgment? In verse 17, Habakkuk concludes his questioning with one final anguished plea. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? Here he expresses his deepest concern. The Babylonians' violence seems endless. They continue to conquer, destroy, and oppress, and Habakkuk wonders how long this will be allowed to continue. His limited view of God's justice leads him to think that the wicked are winning while the righteous are crushed. The prophet feels that something is profoundly wrong. At this point in the dialogue, it becomes evident that Habakkuk is not questioning God's judgment, but the manner in which he has chosen to carry it out. Habakkuk's problem is not that Judah is being corrected, for he himself knows that the people's sin must be addressed. What troubles him is the apparent moral paradox of God using a wicked and violent nation like the Babylonians to discipline Judah. In his mind, this seems to contradict the Lord's holiness and purity. He looks at the Babylonians and sees only evil, destruction, and arrogance, while Judah, though fallen, still maintains a connection to God and his covenant. Habakkuk's struggle is similar to that of many of us today. When we see unjust people prospering and the innocent suffering, it is easy to question God's ways. Why does he seem to allow evil to prevail? Why do the wicked triumph while the righteous are humiliated? These questions are not new, and Habakkuk's dialogue teaches us that it is okay to bring our deepest doubts to God. The prophet does not hide his perplexity or pretend to understand everything. Instead, he approaches the Lord with sincerity and respect, seeking answers that only God can provide. At the end of this second questioning, Habakkuk makes a decision. He recognizes that his questions are limited and that no matter how hard he tries to understand, he still lacks God's perspective. Therefore, at the beginning of chapter 2, he declares that he will wait for the Lord's answer. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. Habakkuk 2:1. Habakkuk's attitude reveals something essential about his faith. Although he does not understand God's ways, he chooses to wait and trust that the Lord will respond. The prophet then positions himself as a watchman, someone who waits attentively for divine revelation. He is not running away from his doubts. He is waiting for God to bring him clarity. Habakkuk's journey is not yet complete. He has asked his questions, expressed his frustrations, and now awaits the Lord's response. Habakkuk teaches us that even in the midst of confusion and apparent silence, the best attitude is to remain vigilant, attentive to what God has to say. He knows that the answer will come and that God's revelation will bring light to what now seems dark and incomprehensible. After expressing his second question and positioning himself as a watchman, attentively awaiting God's answer, Habakkuk finally receives a divine revelation that not only addresses his anguish, but reveals a fundamental principle that transcends time and space. The righteous will live by his faith. It is in chapter 2, beginning with verse 2, that the Lord speaks again, bringing not only words of correction and warning, but also a promise of hope and justice. God begins his response with a clear instruction. In verse 2, he says, "Write down the vision and inscribe it clearly on tablets so that even someone running by may read it." The Lord commands Habakkuk to record the vision permanently because what is being revealed is not just for him, but for everyone who needs to know and understand God's ways. This command symbolizes the importance and certainty of divine revelation. It is true, immutable, and will be fulfilled at the appointed time. What Habakkuk sees is not only for his generation. It is a message that speaks to all ages, to all who seek answers amid chaos. Next, in verse 3, God clarifies something essential about the timing of his actions. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens toward the goal and will not fail. Though it delays, wait for it will certainly come and will not be late. This statement brings both relief and a challenge. On one hand, God assures that his plan is unfailing and that justice will come. On the other, he teaches Habakkuk and all who read these words about the necessity of waiting. God's actions are neither rushed nor delayed. They are always on time. Even if it seems slow from a human perspective, God's promise is steadfast. This verse is an invitation to patience and trust, even when everything around seems to be falling apart. Habakkuk is learning that genuine faith is not circumstantial. It does not depend on immediate answers or a complete understanding of the situation. True faith is anchored in God's character, in the certainty that he is sovereign and faithful, even when his ways seem hidden to us. In verse 4, God reveals to Habakkuk the phrase that would become the centerpiece of the book's message and one of the most impactful declarations in all of Scripture. "Behold, his soul is proud. It is not upright within him, but the righteous will live by his faith." Here, the Lord makes a crucial distinction between two types of people. On one side are those who live with hearts full of pride, trusting only in themselves, like the Babylonians. These people are described as not upright, indicating that their posture before God and the world is marked by arrogance and independence. They believe that their strength and power make them invincible, but their destiny is destruction. On the other hand, there is the righteous, the one who chooses to live by faith. This is the key to God's response and the heart of the revelation to Habakkuk. The righteous do not live by circumstances, human logic, or self-reliance. They live by faith in God, even when everything around them seems to collapse. The word faith here carries the idea of fidelity, trust, and perseverance. It is the certainty that God is in control, regardless of what the eyes can see. The righteous are those who not only believe in God, but live according to that belief. trusting the Lord in times of prosperity, and most importantly, in times of adversity. God's revelation to Habakkuk is a direct answer to his questions and doubts. The prophet had questioned how the Lord could use a wicked people like the Babylonians to bring judgment upon Judah. Now God makes it clear that the Babylonians, despite their apparent strength and success, will not escape divine judgment. In the rest of chapter 2, the Lord details the sins of the Babylonians and the punishments that will fall upon them. The wicked may seem invincible for a time, but their end is determined. They will be destroyed because they trust in their own strength and live for themselves. However, the righteous will follow a different path. The righteous will live by faith, enduring trials and standing firm in the confidence that God will fulfill his promises. This truth resonates deeply, not only for Habakkuk, but for all generations who face moments of crisis and uncertainty. God's message is timeless. When chaos seems to reign, faith in God is what sustains the righteous. It is important to note that this phrase, "the righteous will live by faith," would become a cornerstone of all biblical theology. Later, the Apostle Paul cites it in his letters, Romans 1:17 and Galatians 3:11, emphasizing that justification comes by faith and not by works. This truth was central to the Protestant Reformation when Martin Luther rediscovered the profound meaning of this phrase. Faith is not merely passive belief. It is active trust in the God who is faithful to his promises, even when the world seems to be in ruins. For Habakkuk, this revelation marks a turning point. The prophet began his journey questioning God's apparent inactivity in the face of injustice. Now he begins to understand that divine justice operates in a time and manner beyond human comprehension. God does not ignore evil. He will judge it at the right time. Meanwhile, it is up to the righteous to live by faith, trusting in the Lord's sovereignty and faithfulness. The vision given to Habakkuk is more than just an answer to his questions. It is an invitation to a transformed perspective. Instead of looking only at the circumstances around him, the prophet is called to look to God and trust in his ways. Faith, therefore, becomes the foundation of the righteous person's life. It is faith that sustains him when answers are unclear. It is faith that keeps him steady when the world is in chaos. Habakkuk has not yet seen a change in the reality around him. The Babylonians are still advancing, and Judah still faces corruption and destruction. But now he has something he did not have before, a firm and unchanging promise from God. The righteous will live by faith. This is the answer Habakkuk needed, and it is this answer he will carry with him as he faces the challenges yet to come. As the prophet absorbs this revelation, his heart begins to be transformed. Habakkuk still has questions, but now he possesses a certainty. God is faithful, and his justice will come at the right time. The righteous will not live by what they see, but by what they believe. This truth will become the foundation of his final prayer, a prayer that expresses the confidence of a heart that has learned to rest in God's sovereignty and faithfulness. Habakkuk's journey, marked by sincere questioning and surprising divine answers, reaches its climax in chapter 3. The prophet who began perplexed and distressed ends in a state of worship and unwavering trust in God. This deep transformation did not occur because the circumstances around him changed, but because his vision of God was completely renewed. Habakkuk learned that, even in the midst of calamity, the righteous live by faith, and this faith sustains them as they await the fulfillment of God's promises. Chapter 3 begins with a prayer from Habakkuk, described as a song in verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth. This introduction already suggests something significant. Habakkuk's final prayer is more than a simple request. It is praise in poetic form. The prophet is not merely speaking to God, but exalting him with words that express his total surrender and trust. His heart, once full of unrest, now pours out in worship. In verses 2 and 3, Habakkuk begins his prayer by recalling God's mighty acts in the past. He says, "Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Repeat them in our day. In our time make them known. In wrath remember mercy." These words reveal the prophet's transformed posture. He is no longer dominated by doubt or fear, but acknowledges God's power and sovereignty, asking for his works to be displayed once again. Habakkuk remembers God's great interventions in Israel's history: the exodus from Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, and the miraculous victories in the wilderness. He knows that the God who acted in the past remains the same God who reigns in the present and the future. This recollection of God's character and works brings the prophet to a place of deep reverence. He recognizes that even in the midst of divine judgment, there is room for mercy. Habakkuk does not ask God to cancel his judgment, but in acting to also display his compassion. This balance between judgment and mercy reveals the spiritual maturity the prophet has gained throughout his journey. Habakkuk now understands that God's ways are just, even when they are hard to accept. In the following verses, 3 through 15, Habakkuk describes a majestic vision of God's manifestation. He uses grand and poetic imagery to express the Lord's glory and power. God appears as a triumphant warrior whose presence shakes all of creation. In verse 3, he declares, "God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth." These geographical references, Teman and Paran, point to the wilderness where God led his people during the Exodus. Habakkuk's language connects the present revelation with God's past manifestations, as if the prophet is witnessing the same God who delivered Israel, moving once again with power and glory. The vision continues with awe-inspiring descriptions. In verse 6, Habakkuk states, "He stood and the earth shook. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed, but he marches on forever." These words show that God's power transcends all human and natural forces. Before the Creator, mountains, hills, and entire nations are but dust. God's sovereignty is eternal, and nothing can stand against him. This vision of grandeur and majesty helps Habakkuk understand that God is in absolute control, even when the world seems chaotic. In verses 12 to 15, Habakkuk describes divine intervention as an act of salvation. He says in verse 13, "You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one." The prophet realizes that although judgment is inevitable, the ultimate purpose of God's actions is the salvation of his people. God will not allow his people to be completely destroyed. He will intervene at the right time to bring deliverance. This declaration brings profound hope, as it shows that God will not abandon those who trust in him. Even amid chaos, there is a redemptive purpose in all that the Lord does. In verse 16, Habakkuk describes his personal reaction to this vision. He confesses, "I heard, and my heart pounded, my lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us." The prophet does not hide his fear in the face of God's manifestation. He feels the weight of the reality of judgment, but at the same time, something has changed within him. Habakkuk is now willing to wait patiently for the fulfillment of God's promises. He knows that judgment will come, but he also trusts that God will act at the right time. His faith has been strengthened, and he chooses to rest in the certainty that the Lord is sovereign and faithful. This unwavering confidence reaches its peak in the final verses of the chapter, verses 17 to 19, when Habakkuk declares one of the most beautiful expressions of faith in the entire Bible. He says, Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. These words represent the complete transformation of Habakkuk's heart. He began his journey with questions and lament, but now he chooses to rejoice in God, regardless of the circumstances. The prophet's faith is no longer conditioned on what he sees or understands, but is anchored in God's unchanging character. In verse 19, Habakkuk concludes with a powerful declaration, "The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights." Here, the prophet expresses his complete confidence in God as the source of his strength and security. Just as deer can move with steadiness and agility across difficult and dangerous terrain, Habakkuk now knows that God will enable him to face any challenge. He is no longer bound by fear or doubt. He stands firm in faith. This final prayer from Habakkuk is a powerful testimony of the transformation that takes place when someone chooses to live by faith. The prophet did not receive all the answers he wanted, but he received something much greater, a renewed vision of who God is. He learned to trust in the Lord, even when circumstances made no sense. Habakkuk's prayer teaches us that true faith leads us to worship God, not for what he does, but for who he is. We have now reached the end of this incredible journey through the story of Habakkuk, the prophet who dared to question God and ended up transformed by faith. The central message is clear. The righteous will live by faith, even in difficult and incomprehensible times. May this reflection inspire you to trust in God's sovereign and faithful character, regardless of the circumstances. If you enjoyed this video and believe it can bless others, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you won't miss more content like this, where we explore biblical stories with depth and practical application for our days. Together, we can spread this message of faith and hope. See you in the next video.